Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we saw how Brian changed the Beatles' images and made them more polished and professional looking. He got more money from their live shows, and he kept pounding away until he got the Beatles a tryout at Parlophone with George Martin taking a listen. Brian must have really felt he had accomplished a very major goal. If the Beatles could show their personalities in person, they might have that contract that had been so out of reach. Bob Wooler was one of the first to hear about the Beatles had a contract with EMI. Brian knew that Bob would want to broadcast the news, so he told Bob not to say anything at the moment. He wanted to make sure everything was signed and sealed first. The Beatles, Martin, and Epstein all clicked at the beginning. The Beatles respected that Martin was the producer of two of their beloved goons, Peter Sellers and Spike Mulligan. And when they first met and went to EMI office in Manchester Square, June the 4th, Martin saw their tremendous personality and charisma. Brian and George Martin got along well too. After the test on June 6th, the party went to Alpino restaurant, and George told them, "I like you, and we'll make some records." George Martin was investing in their vitality, because original rock and roll groups did not exist on records in Britain in 1962. George Martin listened to each of them sing, and he wondered who would be his Cliff Richard. George said Paul was the prettiest, John the most offbeat, and he didn't think George's voice was as good as the two. It wasn't until they started singing together that I realized they should be recognized as a group. Financially, EMI had little to lose. The deal that was offered them wasn't that great. George Martin said it was in fact the standard deal for the new artist with a debut record. In those days, a debut was marked by a single rather than an album, so the remuneration was always expressed in currency terms instead of percentages. Epstein accepted EMI's base offer, a penny a single. EMI paid all recording costs, so there was no levies against the penny, but there was no advance payment. They were very happy to get it, said Martin. But looking back, the penny was split 5 ways. The deal guaranteed the Beatles only 4 songs to be recorded each year, and it bound them exclusively to EMI for a 1-year contract, EMI having the option to 3 further options of a year each. So from EMI's view, they were tied up for 4 years. George Martin picked songs from a meager assortment that they had given him, and he chose Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. The Beatles had an unusual sound, unlike anything the 1962 British pop scene was accustomed to. Few artists would write their own material. There was some originality in rock and roll coming from America, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Little Richard. In Britain, popular music was dominated by carefully written love songs from professional writers in Tin Pan Alley, virtually a music factory. Martin wanted them to do a song named How Do You Do It as their debut, and the Beatles didn't like the song. 3 weeks before its release, it was on a white label, and it was played for 4 trusted A&R men. Arthur Muxloe looked at Ron White, and the 2 men nodded. They thought it sounded good. The other people present, though, thought it was a miss. They thought it was just another record. White said they should back Martin's judgment and support the record. Brian got his first copy of Love Me Do during the Jewish New Year when relatives were visiting his house. An aunt from genteel Southport said, "Take it off, what a noise." She preferred Andy Williams, but Brian's younger cousins were intrigued by the unusual sound. Brian's brother Clive was skeptical and said Brian had gone mad to his mother. He said there was going to be a Beatle cult, and he said they would be bigger than Elvis. Brian, it was rumored, stocked 10,000 records of Love Me Do at Liverpool shops. Even if they all sold out, the record could not top the national best-selling list from sales in one city. Brian insisted that he didn't buy the records in bulk to force it on the charts. He said, "I did no such thing, nor never have." When Tito Burns, a former accordionist and bandleader and personal manager of Cliff Richard, telephoned Brian in Liverpool, he asked about the group's availability to do live shows. The song Love Me Do was heading to number 48 on the national charts. Brian sent him a letter stating that the Beatles had a few commitments in January and February, and he said they could no doubt postpone or cancel them. Brian said he was anxious to obtain good work for the boys. He said he would be prepared to accept a fee of $250 a week for anything you may have in mind for January, February. The letter, though, was filed away, and Tito didn't think anything more about it. Within 5 months, Tito would be back in touch with Brian after the Beatles' second single went to the top. Promoter Larry Parnes offered the Beatles a tour. Brian said he was interested, and then they started to haggle over money, and they never did reach an agreement. It was a radical move from going to furniture store dealer to a pop group manager, so the family had to adjust to it. Once Brian made the switch, he was respected. Brian's cousin said that we began to realize he was something special. He thought that with a mother like Queenie, who was a very intelligent, very modern woman, and Uncle Harry, who was ahead of his time, modern thinking, that's why Brian was so special. So Brian was proud, and he took the single to Yankel Feather in Liverpool's basement club. Feather, not surprisingly, wasn't impressed. He said he had once turned John Lennon away from the door of his club because he looked like a hoodlum. So Brian showed Feather the Beatles' pictures, and he said, "Don't get involved with them. They look like little nothings." Feathers and others in the club stated the song Love Me Do sounded like an Arab dirge. "I can't see anyone enjoying this. It's awful." Epstein and the Beatles were the talk of Liverpool, though. Love Me Do was a minor success, peaking at the national charts at 17. It bolstered Brian's confidence, but it was a long way from the world status that he assured the Beatles would reach. George Martin thought they needed a hit to show his signing them was worthwhile. George was looking for a song from Tin Pan Alley, but the Beatles insisted they wanted to do their own songs. Martin said if they could come up with a song that was as good as the one he had found, he would go ahead. The Beatles came up with Please Please Me. It was written by John Lennon, and Lennon got it from a Bing Crosby song, Please. He used a Roy Orbison falsetto. It was written as a slow song, and George Martin thought the tempo needed to be increased. The Beatles agreed, and Martin remembered, "I knew it was a hit. And at the end of that session, I said to them, 'You got your first #1,' and it was." Now the Beatles needed a publisher. George Martin said to go with an English company rather than an American company and give it to someone who was hungry and will work for you. George gave Epstein 3 names: Alan Holmes, who ran Robbins Music, David Platts at Essex Music, and the third, Dick James, an independent publisher. Epstein leaned toward Dick James. This was decided when Brian had an appointment with Francis Day and Hunter, and the man he was supposed to meet was 25 minutes late. That didn't sit well with Brian. He told the receptionist, if a man could not honor an appointment, they had no future together. When he went to Dick James's office, he was 20 minutes early. Brian said, "I'm sorry, I'll sit and wait." The receptionist told James, and he bounced out of his office and ushered Brian in. One fortune was lost and one was won. Dick James had left school at 14, determined to be a singer, and within 3 years he was singing professionally with dance bands. He had a fine ear for hit songs, and a year before he met Epstein, he had branched out on his own as a publisher, having stopped touring so he could be with his wife Frances and young son. Now 44, James was hungry for success. Dick James's 16-year-old son encouraged James to listen to the Beatles. He told James he should sign him. When James heard Please Please Me, he said it was #1. And Brian told James that if he could make the song #1, you could publish it and have Lennon and McCartney on a long-term contract. James said it was a tall order, but he would get right on it. And James arranged for the Beatles to play on Thank Your Lucky Stars on that Saturday. Please Please Me was the first of 7 #1 hits that Dick James published through Brian Epstein within the next year. It was also the first step that 6 men took on the road to becoming millionaires. So I'm going to end the video here. George Martin liked the Beatles and their personalities and felt they had something special and took a chance on them. The Beatles managed to keep using their own songs, and it paid off. They got a publisher, Dick James, and it seemed like everything was starting to roll right along. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it'll help more people to find out about the channel. So I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. If you click in the descriptions part of the video, it takes you to the Amazon page, and if you purchase it, I get a small commission, and that's of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I wish everybody a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.